Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming and also thank the organisers for inviting me to speak here today. As Adora has already said, this is the title of my talk today, and you've already heard about the kind of work that I do, a lot of which is in educational settings, even though my field is population health. I'd like to just begin by saying that I'm sure most of you have heard about Australia's offshore immigration detention system and our harsh policies that aim to deter asylum seekers. I'm not going to dwell on the politics of all of that today, but I will just say that I, like many people I know, am personally ashamed of those policies. And I find it particularly disturbing that some people in other countries, most of which are certainly having to deal with many more refugee arrivals than Australia, see Australia as leading by example with those policies. So I'll move on to what I want to speak about today. I just want to say that I want to acknowledge the work of an organisation in Australia called Foundation House, or the Victorian Foundation for the Survivors of Torture. Much of the work that I have done in this area has been in partnership with them, and I'm drawing very heavily on some of their programs in this presentation today. So my talk will be in three parts. I want to begin by talking about the importance of understanding the refugee experience, then move on to discuss some theoretical and conceptual frameworks and models that I think are useful when we're thinking about how do we work with refugee background young people and families in education. And then I'll present some case studies that show how some of those theories have been integrated into practice. Okay, so moving to the first part. This is probably not news to anyone here, but I just wanted to start with some definitions. So a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. So that's the definition according to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, and I would imagine that for most of us, our countries have signed up to give people protection if they meet that definition. An asylum seeker is a person who has applied for refugee protection and is awaiting a decision. So many asylum seekers are also refugees, but they haven't yet been assessed to legally meet the definition. So that's all very legal, and I'd just like to also propose an alternative definition, that being a refugee does not equal some distinct identity. It rather defines a temporary, and more often than not, a prolonged state in which ordinary people find themselves when going through extraordinary ordeals as a result of social and political upheaval in their homeland. So refugees may be rich, they may be poor, they may be educated or uneducated. Many are young, many of them are just like us. They're ordinary people who had jobs, lives, families, and then their lives have been thrown into turmoil. There are currently, these figures are just over a year old. These are from 2017, and at the end of that year, there were an estimated 68.5 million people who had been forcibly displaced from their homes. That figure is now over 70 million, and that's the highest number there has been since statistics began being collected. Looking at the 2017 figures, 40 million of those people are still inside their own countries, so they're internally displaced. 25.4 million are outside, so they meet the definition of being refugees. And 3.1 million are asylum seekers outside their country of origin and waiting for their status to be determined. 57% of the world's refugees in 2017 came from just three countries, Syria, Afghanistan and South Sudan, all of which have been experiencing war and conflict for many years, and in the case of South Sudan and Afghanistan, for generations. It's really important, I think, to remember that 85% of the world's refugees are being hosted in the developing world. They're not in Europe and they're not in Australia. We need to think critically about the way we use the term refugee crisis, therefore, in the European context. The countries currently hosting the most refugees are Turkey, with 3.5 million, Uganda and Pakistan, who each host 1.4 million. Lebanon hosts the equivalent of a third of its own population, 1 million refugees. And there are also almost 1 million refugees in Iran, a country that also produces many refugees of its own. The other thing to note here is that only a tiny proportion of the world's refugees are resettled through the UNHCR programs in wealthier countries. So there were just over 100,000 people resettled in that way in 2017. If we zero in on Europe, this diagram shows asylum applications to the EU between 2008 and 2018. As I mentioned, I think we need to think critically about the term refugee crisis with respect to Europe and about the political work that is being done when that term is used. This figure shows that applications for asylum in Europe peaked in 2015-2016 at around 1.3 million and have declined considerably since then. This number clearly represents a lot of people, but it is still many fewer than the number received by some much poorer individual countries that are close to refugee-producing conflicts. Because I'm going to be drawing a little later on some Australian case studies, I'd also like to just touch briefly on the situation in Australia, which has some similarities as well as differences to Europe. So I just want to play a quick game here of true or false. So the first statement, Australia subjects asylum seekers to extremely harsh mandatory detention policies. Who here thinks that one's true? It's true, it's certainly true. Second statement, opinion polls show majority of Australians support these policies of deterrence. Who thinks that's true? Yeah, it's true. Thirdly, Australia has a well-regarded refugee resettlement program. Do we think that one's true? Maybe a fewer people? That is actually also true. And D, the majority of Australians endorse the policy of multiculturalism and support for new arrivals to facilitate their integration. Can that be true? Yes, all of these statements are true. So there are some definitely apparent inconsistencies in both our attitudes and our policies. But I guess that's probably the same here as well. Okay, so I just want to move on now to talking about the refugee experience. Of course, we know that many people become refugees because of war, and this has particular consequences. This photo is taken from a strike on the Children's Hospital in Aleppo in Syria some time ago. It might help us to imagine some of the experiences of wars many refugee families and children have been exposed to. Chronic fear, chaos, separation, experiencing and witnessing violence, death and destruction, rapes and murders, loss of people and property, poor health access, poor food and water access, homelessness, impossible choices, decisions and consequences. Also sexual assault and exploitation and conscription of child soldiers are common experiences. Let's try to imagine what that experience might be like for a particular child and his or her family. This is a picture of a boy in the courtyard of his house next to a room that was damaged in a mortar attack in a northern Syrian city. His father was seriously wounded, and the boy received slight wounds when the shell struck the house as the family was eating. The family, until this point, has made a choice to stay. How hard was this decision? What happens if the mother wanted to go and the father said to stay, and something happens, someone dies? How do they live with this? What are the potential long-term consequences for this choice? What developmental stage is this child in? What is being lost, disrupted for him? His parents probably told him to stay inside, that it would be safer for him. When the mortar came through the roof and shattered that, what does he now think about his parents' ability to protect him, to keep him safe? In the future, when all is hopefully calm, how will his assumptions of safety possibly be affected? How does his mother feel about her ability to protect her children? How does his father feel? This is a photo of Aleppo in Syria, and it shows Aleppo as it was before the war and as Aleppo is pretty much now, or certainly towards the end of the war. And I'd just like to show you a short video clip of a family who came from Aleppo. And I'm sure the technology is going to...
Vandaag. طلعوا نفذه.
وقت اجت داعش اخذته كان تحت بمقره، حاطين له هيك طناجه ما احسن شوفه، اخذوه قدام عيوني وعم ببشروه بالدمح ما احسن يساوي شيء، ما عاد شفته. بلدنا تدمرت، كل شيء كويس راح، كل شيء. انا قررت اني اطلع. اعتبرينا طالعين زيارة هيك على الريف النهار الجاي.
باي باي حلب، باي باي مدرستي، باي باي رفقاتي، باي باي ولاد عمتي، باي باي نانتي. بدي اشتاق لكم كثير 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 كثير.
نحن بنحبك يا سوريا عزيزنا. قطعت قطعة من قلبي وحطيت لك يا على باب الدار. يا بابا.
So that's from a film called Children on the Front Line. And I guess it's just to make us feel, what it must be like for some of these families. This picture suggests that we can also observe, that children can be incredibly resilient. The photo is the work of an artist, Ugo Galenkis, and you can see more of his extraordinary work online if you are interested. It also reminds us that we can't forget about the damage that may be masked by smiles. Schools and other institutions in countries of refuge can play an incredibly important role in supporting recovery and integration through inclusive and trauma-informed practices. And that's what I'd like to move on to speaking about now. So in this next section of my presentation, I want to talk about some different models and conceptual frameworks that can inform our work in education settings. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm drawing very much on the work of Foundation House, who is an organisation that provides services to people from refugee backgrounds in Australia, in my state of Victoria. They've been working for a long time providing direct counselling services, but they also work, they also have a sector development team where they work, particularly in education settings, to try to ensure that schools and other institutions are responsive to the needs of people from refugee backgrounds. So this is a picture of their trauma recovery conceptual framework, and they pose 4 recovery goals: restoring safety and control, restoring people's connections and belonging, restoring meaning, identity and justice, and also dignity and value. So this next slide shows, show the whole lot. The next slide shows an extended version of that framework. The framework provides a way to conceptualise the causes and personal impact of traumatic events, as well as ways to support the recovery of survivors. The first column identifies the many types of persecution and state-sanctioned violence used by oppressive regimes to destroy both the bodies and minds of the individual, their connections to their families, and often the spirit and fabric of their communities. The second column shows the impacts of persecutory violence. Each person is different. How they come to understand their experiences will impact on their trauma reaction over time. Violence is not limited to direct experiences. It includes witnessing violence against others. Violence breaks physical and emotional connections, and the resulting isolation may do as much harm or more harm than physical injury. Violence and persecution can also bring about fundamental changes in a person's belief systems about the self, others, and the world. This is sometimes described as internalising violence. In a persecutory regime, acts of violence can be performed by anyone, people known to the survivors. Sources of violence are unpredictable. Nowhere is safe. The third column describes the symptoms that can be brought about by those experiences. The processes and challenges of resettlement in a new country can also exacerbate many of these symptoms. And then in our fourth column, we have the recovery goals that I mentioned before. Okay, this is another framework some of you may be familiar with. It comes from some research done in the UK, looking at domains that support integration for people from refugee backgrounds. And it's work that I've drawn on a lot in my work in education settings. The framework suggests that there's a series of interconnected domains. At the foundation are rights and citizenship. These are connected to the need to support language and culture, gaining of language and cultural knowledge in a new country, also a sense of safety and stability. The framework also suggests that social connections are absolutely vitally important, and that people need different types of social connections. They need social bonds, social links, and social bridges. Social bonds are the connections we have to people in our families and close friends that provide us with emotional and practical support. Social bridges are connections that we have to people across some kind of divides. There may be people from other cultures, people from different socioeconomic status, people from different countries, different genders, and these are the connections we need to get access to new resources that we don't already have in our own circle. And research also tells us that social links are extremely important for people resettling in a new country. Social links are about connections to institutions such as schools, and there's a lot of research showing their importance. At the top of this diagram are what are described as the markers and means of integration: employment, housing, education, and health. And all of these domains are linked and need to be there to support integration. Okay, when we're working with families and young people from refugee backgrounds, I think it's also helpful to think about the impact of cultural differences. This picture describes culture as being like an iceberg, where most is below the surface. The cultural features that we can see are things like food, dress, music, literature, and language, and these things are the relatively superficial components of culture. Below the surface are many unspoken rules, such as around courtesy, concepts of time, concepts of personal space, body language, eye contact, courtship rituals, ideas about modesty. And even deeper are the unconscious rules we all follow, such as those concerning the nature of friendships, attitudes towards elders, the meaning of childhood or adolescence, definitions of insanity, what are people's roles in relation to age, sex, class, occupation and kinship, etc. All of these have a profound effect on how we act in and experience the world. I would suggest that the concept of cultural humility is useful to help us respond constructively to cultural differences. Cultural humility is, I think, qualitatively different from the idea of cultural competence, which suggests that we can get to a point where we know how to understand different cultures. I would also make the point that neither our own nor others' cultures are static or singular. We all have constantly evolving and multiple cultural identities. So cultural humility involves having a lifelong curiosity to learn from others. It involves being critically self-evaluative of cultural awareness, of having an other-oriented stance open to new cultural information. And it involves developing partnerships to address power imbalances that occur across cultures. I would like now to also consider intersectionality as a relevant theoretical framework for working across difference. Intersectionality is a sociological theory that considers how various categories of oppression interact on multiple and simultaneous levels, contributing to systematic social inequality. The term was formulated in 1989 by American black feminist legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, who argued that black women were excluded from feminist discourse, which was based on the worldview and experience of white women, and from anti-racist discourse, which was equated with black men. The theory maintains that the experience of a particular individual or group results from the interaction of multiple modes of oppression or privilege, such as those based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, class, or disability. If we want to understand outcomes for refugee adolescent girls, for example, or many other groups that are disadvantaged or marginalised for that matter, we need to examine the ways in which things like culture, gender, language, religion, immigration status, and socioeconomic status interact with corresponding processes of oppression and discrimination, such as racism, sexism, Islamophobia, and classism. Finally, just one more conceptual model that can aid our thinking. You might recognise this as a socio-ecological model for thinking about how we can promote health and wellbeing at different levels. It's used frequently in public health, which is my field. This is a framework that I've put together for thinking about how we can intervene to promote wellbeing and inclusion for refugee families. So on your left are what I've described as the drivers of wellbeing and inclusion, being social networks, social capital, and cross-sectoral partnerships. In the centre, the model suggests that at an individual level we need to support people's belonging and sense of wellbeing. At an interpersonal level we need to support their opportunities for connectedness. At a community level we need to support social inclusion and opportunities for participation. And at a societal level we need to advocate for policies that reduce social inequalities and increase social cohesion. On the right are strategies that are associated with positive outcomes for refugee families. These include celebrating diversity, providing welcoming and culturally sensitive environments, ensuring flexible and local delivery of programs, employing people from refugee communities as liaisons and workers, engaging with parents, working with interpreters, and recognising people's strengths and aspirations, as well as the challenges that they face. Okay, so I'm going to move on to discussing a couple of case studies from my work. And this is work, there's two particular programs I want to focus on. Both of these are programs that Foundation House runs and that I've done research looking at. Just one more set of concepts before we move on though. When trying to support disadvantaged groups, some population health scholars have argued that we need proportionate universalism when providing services, and I would suggest that this concept is also relevant in education. So universal services, which in this case would be schools, must be non-exclusionary and aim to reduce discrimination and ensure equal treatment for all. But we also need targeted services, such as specialist programs that attend to the particular needs of marginalised groups and promote inclusion. So proportionate universalism then is a combination of targeted and universal policies and services that considers people at the bottom of the gradient and the gradient as a whole, ensuring that the impact of services is proportionately greater at the bottom to promote equality. So moving on to the context for my Australian case studies, young people of refugee backgrounds face multiple challenges in engaging in education following settlement. Pre-arrival experiences are characterised by exposure to violence, loss, persecution, perpetration of human rights violations, and forced displacement that includes prolonged insecurity and often protracted periods in transit countries, with associated significant disruptions to formal education. Post-settlement challenges include learning a new language, adapting to unfamiliar systems and discrimination, often accompanied by economic and social marginalisation. Despite these challenges, most refugee young people and their families are also highly motivated to succeed in education, and they have high aspirations for their future. I would argue that it's vital that we do our best to support those aspirations and their potential. So Australia's resettlement program generally focuses on areas of protracted refugee displacement. What this means in practice is that people who arrive have often experienced multi-generational trauma, which has profound impacts for their families. This table also reminds us that there are refugees coming from many parts of the world. Whilst we might be currently focused on the situations in Syria and Iraq, for example, there are still many people fleeing persecution in a number of different African countries, as well as in my region, where, for example, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people have been forced to flee from Myanmar in recent years. So the first program that I wanted to talk about is called the School Support Program, and one part of which is an intensive program called the Refugee Education Support Program. It's a program that's conducted as a partnership between Foundation House and the Department of Education in Victoria, and also an organisation called the Centre for Multicultural Youth. And the aim here is to make universal services, schools, more inclusive and better able to cater to the needs of students with refugee backgrounds. Schools are clearly a critical site for promoting successful settlement outcomes and social inclusion. I've already discussed the challenges for recently arrived students. Exposure to violence, we must remember, also comprises a risk factor for poor mental health outcomes for young people, while social support in the country of settlement has been shown to be protective. In the absence of appropriate support and responsiveness by schools, the impact on education and learning can be profound. Affected students may demonstrate lack of engagement, feelings of disempowerment, absenteeism, a failure to establish and sustain healthy relationships, early exit from school, and therefore significantly poorer achievement and associated poor long-term prospects. So the Refugee Education Support Program is a program where Foundation House staff work for 2 years at a time with clusters of 6 to 8 primary and secondary schools in an area, and they work with 5 of these clusters at any one time. So at any one time there's about 30 to 40 schools involved. Professional learning workshops are conducted for staff. The schools are assisted to do an audit of their processes and activities, thinking through how well they meet the needs of refugee background students. The schools then develop an action plan to address any gaps that they've found in their audits. And they also, they're strongly encouraged to be involved in community engagement and participation strategies to support families, as well as to partner with local community, business and government organisations so that you have a whole network of support for those families. There's a whole lot of associated resources that accompany the school support program, and these are all available on the Foundation House website, which you could just Google, or the URL is there. So these include models and strategies for schools to implement buddy programs to help connect students to each other, strategies to address racism, strategies to address behavioural issues, ways to improve enrolment procedures so that they're more inclusive for refugee students, strategies for trauma recovery, and also resources to help schools understand the impacts of learning and wellbeing of the refugee experience. So I've been involved in 2 different studies that looked at the school support program. The first of these was an evaluation of the Refugee Education Support Program, which is then called School Support Program, in which we interviewed staff and also collated audit data from the schools that were participating. And this found that the program supported a holistic and whole school approach that enabled schools to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for students from refugee backgrounds. In more recent research, I worked with Foundation House staff to conduct a study with students of refugee backgrounds in some of the schools that were participating. And that produced the report that you can see there, and that's also available online. So I would just like to share some quotes from the studies, from these studies. So the first is from a student. I think for people like us, when they first come to a new school, a new country, the worst thing is that they feel lonely. We've lost all our friends, so when you first come here, you don't know anyone, and any activity that gets you to know more people will really help. The second is from a school leader. If we hadn't had that great awareness developed through the program, we would have just gone, well, okay, here's some students. Yes, we need to look after them. They can just go to English as additional language classes. But we wouldn't have been aware that there's a whole range of things that we need to provide. Also from these studies, another quote from a staff member. Our enrolment, that would probably have been the major thing that changed. We designed new forms and parents had an interview, and I could fill out the forms with the parents, making sure that they've got background information on where they come from, how long they've been here, who lives in the home, the languages they speak. And this school found that through this process, they really also started to develop good relationships with the parents, which was so vital to supporting the students. The last quote from a student. For the teacher, they need to understand that if they give advice, they can change a student's future. It's the little things that make up the big things. You start small, but it's the teacher that drives you towards the pathway. The teacher needs to be really careful, though, what they say, like discrimination. You don't want to say, we can't do this. And students certainly reported a lot of instances where schools had very low expectations of them. They equated their lack of English language proficiency, for example, with a lack of ability to learn, and that was something that students found really obvious and really frustrating. Okay, so the second program that I wanted to highlight is called the You Can Too program. This program is developed also in partnership between Foundation House and the Centre for Multicultural Youth, and with a number of different English language education providers. Most people arriving in Australia as part of the Humanitarian Settlement program undertake 6 to 12 months of intensive English language tuition when they first arrive. For young people, this is provided either in specialist English language schools or English language centres, and sometimes it's provided within mainstream schools. So the You Can Too program aims to facilitate and support the social inclusion of young people of refugee background aged 16 to 26 years. So this is a slightly older group. By strengthening mental health and wellbeing, social connections and networks, their access and engagement in education, training and employment pathways. And it also supports cooperation between providers of education, social support, training and employment. And I probably should mention, I would see that the school support program as being an example of working to support universal services, whereas the You Can Too program is a targeted service for refugee students. So the program operates 1 day per week, generally within on-arrival English language classes for 16 weeks. It provides contextualised and experiential learning focusing on work skills with opportunities for part-time work experience or volunteering for students. It provides psychosocial support to assist with recovery from trauma and emotional wellbeing, and that's conducted in a group setting and is very powerful. It also works to develop social connections and networks through bringing volunteers into the classroom, bringing in support agencies, and, as I said, group work that creates strong connections amongst the You Can Too student group. The facilitators also provide one-on-one support and referrals to appropriate agencies for young people who require that additional support. So key findings from the research that we did looking at the You Can Too program was that it did promote English language learning for students. It supported their engagement in education and employment pathways, increased the size and diversity of their social networks, fostered their confidence and resilience, and built the capacity of teachers to respond to the needs of young people of refugee backgrounds. And I will just also share some quotes from that research. So the first is from a student. You can too help me improve my English because we are communicating with new people, getting to know new people. And a teacher, which I guess shows how language and connections are so intertwined, which gets back to some of those frameworks we looked at, which suggest that we need to be looking at the holistic needs of people if we want them to learn as well. Then a teacher said, the program gave them so much opportunity to voice opinions, engage in discussion, do a bit of reading and writing as well, that I thought it benefited their speaking and listening so much, and we were able to move most of the class up into level 3 after 6 months, which doesn't always happen. In this research, we also looked at the changes to participants' social networks from the beginning to the end of the program. So analysis of the longitudinal data that we got for 100 participants who were present at both the beginning and the end showed a statistically significant increase in the median number of reported connections. Their reported Australian-born friends increased from a median of 0 at the beginning to 1 by the end, and overseas-born friends increased from a median of 2 to 5. Participants also reported more connections to what they described as other important people who represented linking connections. And these included people like teachers, counsellors, people from a number of other agencies that they'd been linked to. Importantly, we also saw fewer people reporting that they had no friends. This reduced from 65% at the beginning, reporting that they had no Australian-born friends, to 46% at the end. And at the beginning, 16% reported that they had no overseas-born friends, and this reduced to 6% by the end. We also used a resilience measure, and we found that there was a measurable increase in young people's resilience associated with their increases in social networks. So on that topic, the participants had much to say. So the students said and it was a really strong theme across all of the people that we spoke to. So these are some quotes from students. Yes, I think the UCAN2 program, it makes us friendlier than the school classes. We feel like when we go to the UCAN2 class, we are friendlier than the English class. Another said, getting to know about people in Australia, I get to know other people like you and the volunteers. When we did the work experience, we know other people from Australia, like the manager, my supervisor, and other employees. So they really felt that it had connected them to people they would not otherwise have been able to meet. As I mentioned, the volunteers also come into the classroom from the wider community, and this third student said, the volunteers know a lot of Australia. That's the thing. You can find a job off them and you can learn more English because they speak English. You can speak English with them. Another really strong theme was around confidence, and again, almost all of the participants we spoke to talked about how their confidence had been improved through the program. So this is just 2 quotes from students. I wasn't confident. Personally, I'm a shy person. So after this, I became confident, so I can have a voice. I can see and I can share my feelings. Another said, it was fantastic and so helpful for me, and also helped to get friends, which is great. And also the most important for me is to have more confidence. Okay, so that's the end of my, I'm not going to show that one, of my case studies and the end of my talk. I think I've left plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.